so the command center sort of the endocrine system is where? What would you say that is?
Um, Hypothalamus.
Yeah, nice. Okay. So the hypothalamus is responsible for like regulating all the things in the endocrine system. And what does it signal to? Well, first of all, what's it release? Broadly speaking, not like every
Um,
single hormone, but
GnRH.
okay, that's one of the things. So I meant broadly in terms of just like, so it releases these things called GnRH is one of them for sure, but you don't actually have to know all the hypothalamus hormones, which is kind of strange just based on what all they make you know for this test. But so these are going to be called the primary tropic hormones.
Oh, right.
And this is not trophic, that comes later. This is different. This is tropic. Tropic, what does it mean if something's a tropic hormone?
It is what sends the signal to release the secondary hormone.
Okay, yeah. It's
Well,
basically a
actually,
hormone that
kinase.
just its only job, a tropic hormone just regulates levels of other hormones.
Hmm.
Whereas a direct hormone or an effector hormone, you can call it either
Hmm.
one, is a hormone that actually does stuff. So these
Hmm.
primary tropic hormones don't really do a whole lot other than go signal for other hormones. So what does the hypothalamus from a from a endocrine perspective, where does the hypothalamus send its signals? Kind of David.
I wonder. The pituitary gland,
Right.
among
Yeah.
others.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So there are two parts of it: anterior and posterior pituitary.
Hmm.
All right. So let's start with the. Well, actually, each of these have their own little pathway from down from the hypothalamus into the pituitary. So which one do you know either of them, or which one is which, or tell me what you know about that?
Are you are you asking about the how they receive signals from the hypothalamus,
Yeah,
or
yeah. Like what's the means of getting stuff from the hypothalamus to the two different parts of the pituitary?
um, the um, HPA axis, or the blood? Um, yeah, it's called the HPA axis.
Well, there's the hypothalamic pituitary axis, which I think is
Yes.
what you're referring to. But there's actually
Yeah.
like two different specific pathways in here that are
Hmm.
responsible for sending this stuff. And so one of them is called the one to the anterior pituitary is called the hypophyseal portal system.
Right. Yes. Okay.
And yeah, so this is like its own little, anytime you see the word portal physiologically, it means like a separate set of blood vessels that are responsible for like carrying one tiny thing directly from one place to another place. And so there
Okay.
aren't very many of them. The primary one you think of in the body is in the liver, but the portal, vein, portal, artery, all that stuff. Um, but you have one up here in the hypothalamus as well. Why do you think it is that the hypothalamus to the pituitary, that little uh pathway there gets its own specific vessels? Why doesn't the hypothalamus just dump its hormones into systemic circulation like everything else does?
Well, one for efficiency, and two, so that very like specific levels of these certain tropic hormones and what is then released afterwards from the pituitary can um, be picked up for negative or whatever feedback is then
Yeah,
reacted. Yeah.
those are both really good. Yeah, both really good answers. I really like I think, did you say efficiency answer?
Yeah.
Like the first thing you said? Yeah, because the hypothalamus, if you think about it, is in a really, really, really expensive real estate district in the brain. And
Mhm.
so it doesn't have the space to build all the machinery necessary to affect the to dump everything that is dumping into systemic circulation, because then it would just need to make way more of all that stuff, and it would just need more space, and brain real estate is expensive. So yeah, so it just has these specific pathways that it sends stuff to the anterior and posterior pituitary glands
Mhm.
so that it doesn't have to do that. What about the one to the posterior pituitary? Do you know what it's called?
Um, I believe that's the pituitary stalk, or like because it's not through the portal system, it's through actual like neuron endings or neuron
Yeah, nice.
yeah, terminals.
Exactly. Yeah, I think it's called the neurophysial tract, and then it goes the thing that carries it is the stalk, like the
Mhm.
but yeah, so it's called the neurophysial tract. And just like you said, these are neurons whose cell bodies live in the hypothalamus and whose axons project down into the posterior pituitary, so that like so that the presynaptic terminal is actually in the posterior pituitary, so that it releases all this stuff, like all the neurotransmitters that it releases are
Mhm.
the posterior pituitary hormones. So the posterior pituitary itself doesn't actually do anything except just
Mhm.
hold these hormones the hypothalamus makes. Okay, cool.
Okay.
What are those two hormones in the posterior pituitary?
Vasopressin and oxytocin.
Nice. Yeah, exactly. What do they do?
Uh, a lot, I guess. Oxytocin is involved in labor and the female reproductive system.
Nice.
Vasopressin is involved in aggression, water retention. Um, what else?
Mm-hmm.
No, not lactation. Never mind.
Right. Yeah. So
Oxytocin is with
vasopressin and it's also called antidiuretic hormone. Vasopressin is, but you said the water retention thing, so I assume you know. I just wanted to mention it. So, but yeah, that's absolutely perfect. Okay, cool. Moving on from there. So yeah, those do those things. What hormones are made and released by the anterior pituitary then?
oh, so many.
Yeah.
Um, Follicle stimulating hormone.
Do you know the mnemonic for it? Just making sure, just checking before we
The
start.
mnemonic?
There's this thing called, or is it I don't know what a mnemonic. There's this thing called flat peg.
That's incredible. Oh my god.
Yeah.
Okay.
This this is the best way to remember this though. So anyway, you said follicle stimulating hormone already.
Yeah. So FSH, luteinizing hormone, um, ACTH, which for the life of me I can't pronounce as like an actual hormone.
Yeah,
Um,
me neither.
Thyroid stimulating hormone, um, prolactin, endorphins, growth
Nice.
hormones.
Are you cheating?
No, you
No,
you gave
no, I'm
me
saying
the
that's
mnemonic.
really,
I
really,
was
really good.
I wasn't about to remember all of them, but I mean
No, like, but
that
still,
actually
I do
works.
this with a lot of people, and most people know the mnemonic and don't get it. So yeah, nice. Perfect. Okay, this is gonna be quick. And these are all collectively called the secondary tropic hormones, although like the PEG hormones kind of debatably tropic. Like, like prolactin is definitely, I mean, prolactin does some tropic stuff, but it also has some direct effects. Endorphins, pretty much just direct effects. Growth hormone, kind of both.
Yeah.
So yeah. Anyway.
Are all
Um,
are all of them gonna be there was I remember in the reading there was one that was an exception, I think, but are all of them gonna be negative feedback to the hypothalamus?
um, all of these. Yeah. Yeah, well, all of them except prolactin's weird. LH and so LH and FSH have some weird action as well. Prolactin, I'm trying to remember exactly what it does on prolactin would be as well. The one that you're thinking of that doesn't have negative feedback to the hypothalamus is probably going to be oxytocin, actually. So it's going to, during
Oh,
uterine
okay.
contraction.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a
Yeah.
positive feedback loop in uterine contraction, but there's also some positive feedback that happens not with necessarily FSH or LH. I'll just show you in a second. In FSH and LH, it's really estrogen that at one point has a positive feedback effect to the
Yeah.
hypothalamus. But that's something that like I don't think it'll say in any textbooks. If it does, then I'll be really surprised, because it's something that I kind of had to really go digging for whenever I was studying for the MCAT. So like
Oh,
I had to read it in like a paper to find it. But
okay.
just because it annoyed me that it happened that way, that nobody would explain it. So I'll show you in a little bit. So Yeah, so that's what all of these are. So what do each of these do? What's FSH, LH? What does all
Follicle
that stuff do?
stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone are involved in menstruation, or like the female reproduction system in
Okay.
general. Also the male reproductive system, because they definitely
Okay.
dictate.
Yeah.
Yeah. ACTH is involved in stress,
What's it?
cortisol.
Okay. Yeah. So it
Yeah,
leads
it
to
relates
cortisol
to,
release
yeah.
from where?
From where? Oh, is it the pancreas?
No.
No. Oh, adrenal glands.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay, cool.
What
I
part of
almost
the adrenal glands is the cortex or the medulla?
um cortisol is released from the cortex. No, it's the
Yes,
medulla.
nice.
Oh
No,
wait,
it's
yes. Okay.
cortex. Yeah, yeah, it's
I don't
cortex.
know
Nice. All right, cool. We'll go over that in a second too. So, what about TSH?
that. Thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates the thyroid.
Yeah,
T3
exactly.
and T4. Um,
All right. What about the other ones?
Prolactin also involved in the female reproductive system and lactation, which is that also the one that is affected by oxytocin
Um,
or no?
prolactin and oxytocin. I'm trying to think. I don't think so though. I don't have anything in my
Uh,
brain coming to me immediately. Prolactin and dopamine are kind of like antagonistic pairs, interestingly. Uh, but I don't think that they care about that on this test. I haven't seen dopamine in any of this stuff.
I think I was thinking of dopamine. Never mind.
Oh, okay.
Um, Speaking of which, endorphins.
Yeah.
um, those are, I mean,
So these are so
oh,
really
pain.
like
Okay.
these aren't going to be tested. It's pain like sensitization or desensitization. Like it makes stuff not hurt. I always just tell people think of like the runner's high. That's what this is.
Right.
And that seems to be a good way to get people to remember. It's not gonna that one won't. I'll be shocked if that one's tested just because it's a waste of time. And there's only so many questions they can ask, and there's plenty to test you on. So they should not test that. And then growth hormone.
Growth hormone is involved in a lot of things.
All right.
I mean, bone
Growth stuff.
growth, hair growth, all the growth.
Right. Yeah. And it definitely has some direct effect on that stuff. And so the thing that I'm gonna write here is though is actually like it's more important action, which is it upregulates release of insulin like growth factor.
Oh, okay.
And insulin like growth factor is the one that actually does all the growth hormone stuff that you think about. I mean, growth hormone
Okay.
does it a little bit too, but it's primarily insulin like growth factor.
Ooh, okay. And is that in a specific location that I need to make note of? Or
I want to say for some reason I want to say it's from the pancreas, but I don't think it is. I'm pretty sure it's from the liver, but
okay,
I'm not completely sure on that right this second. You could look it up.
okay.
Yeah, it's like I would be shocked if it's from the pancreas because I'm pretty sure it's not. Like the pancreas is there's not that much going on there, and well there is, but uh endocrine wise, the pancreas is only responsible for like somatostatin, insulin, and glucagon, I think, and versus like it does a lot exocrine wise, meaning like into the digestive tract, but I'm pretty sure I would remember it if insulin like growth factor was from there. I think it's just the insulin part that's making me think that. Pretty sure this is liver. When in
Okay.
doubt, a protein, if you're not sure where a protein's from, guess liver, because it's probably the liver. Like liver does a
Noted.
lot of stuff. Yeah. Um, okay, cool. So that is a bunch of those. I didn't write anything for FSH and LH because we can talk about that more right now down here. So this is like the most difficult art project for me, but so the menstrual cycle is likely to be tested. It's pretty high yield. And even if it's not tested on the MCAT, you're going to get tested on it in med school over and over again. So might as well know it. All right. So the menstrual cycle, the way that this is defined, at least medically speaking, is so that day 0 is the first day of menstruation.
Okay.
So I just put like first day of bleeding is day 0. And so then like halfway around here somewhere is going to be day 14. And then the end is day 28. And that's just like the basic way of doing this. We're going to graph a whole bunch of stuff on this thing, which is why it's hard. And also we're going to try to keep track of simultaneously what's going on in the ovary and in the uterus, which is like very hard to do all this stuff at once. Yeah, exactly. So much stuff all at once. So I'm only going to draw one side of that. Okay, so this is the ovary. All right,
Wow.
so that's a fallopian tube. This is uterus.
So artistic.
Thanks. All right, so now starting day 0 of all of the hormones that we care about here are really, really low at day 0. And by all the hormones we care about, I'm referring to FSH, referring to LH. What else are we referring to?
Estrogen and progesterone.
Nice. Estrogen and progesterone. Nice, that'll work. Progesterone. I just write E and P for those pretty much always. Like I got in med school, it just came up so much. I just got to the habit of just writing E for estrogen everywhere. And I always just knew it meant estrogen.
That makes sense.
So the good thing about starting at day 0 here is that all of those are at 0 on day 0 effectively. And so since FSH, LH in particular, but estrogen and progesterone do some too, have negative feedback on the hypothalamus, then what do you think is likely the case with GnRH at this point?
GnRH is going to also be low if they're low.
No, so they all have negative feedback on GnRH. So while these are all low,
so it's going to be high, and then
they're
low, and then once they're raised later on in the cycle, GnRH will be low as well.
Yeah, exactly. So the GnRH is really, really high right now, and so the GnRH being really high causes what to happen?
Causes what to happen?
Yeah, what's GnRH do?
It stimulates the release of FSH and LH.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so GnRH is high at the very beginning, and so that's going to start telling FSH and LH to just increase, and not really LH as much as FSH. So the thing with LH is that the receptors responsible for signaling the release of LH are very non-sensitive period to GnRH, and so they just don't really respond at all here. So it's just kind of gonna chill at first, whereas FSH will start to increase because, like you said, GnRH is high. And so as FSH increases, what does FSH stand for?
Follicle stimulating hormone.
Okay, so what do you think is going to happen as FSH increases?
The follicle is stimulated because it's the follicular phase.
Okay, yeah, exactly. Okay, so what does it mean to stimulate the follicle? What starts happening?
Shedding of the endometrial lining.
That already happened at day 0.
Oh, it already happened. Okay.
Yeah. Well, that process already kind of started.
Right. You'd think I'd know more about this.
No, it's always, there was the most awkward experience for me was there's one day I was teaching a Kaplan course. It was like 12 girls and me. as it. I was just like, this sucks today. Like, this is just irony, but
Oh,
yeah.
wow. What happened? Oh, the follicles will begin the production of estrogen, or is that from the other hormones?
Yeah, no, they do. Yeah. So
Okay.
follicle stimulating hormone is going to come in from the pituitary and stimulate what is called the follicles inside. And so the follicles are just like follicle is like a sac with an ovum in it. So like a sac with an egg in it. The follicle is just the like, I don't know, it's like just the sac that holds the egg forever. And so whenever FSH binds to the follicle, it causes the follicles to grow. So FSH is a trophic signal on follicles. Trophic, just add the H before the I to the word that we had before. Trophic to the follicles. So it causes all of them to start growing and maturing a little bit. However, the follicles themselves will release what's called a paracrine factor. So what does it mean if they're releasing a what does paracrine mean?
What does paracrine mean? Oh my God, I should know this. Signaling to other cells.
Yeah, specifically other cells that are like in its neighborhood, basically.
Right.
Yeah. So para typically just means like close to, more or less. So that there are like 4 different types of crines. So there's endocrine, which is like really far away all the way across the body because you're dumping hormones into the endovascular system, which is pumped everywhere. So that's the furthest away. Paracrine, I think, is next, which is kind of like in the general vicinity. Then there's juxtacrine, which is cells right next to one another. And autocrine is obviously like
Within.
dumping hormones on yourself. Yeah.
Okay.
So the follicles will release a inhibitory factor in a paracrine manner so that they are basically like trying to inhibit the growth of all their neighbors while they start to grow. And so what occurs during the first like little bit here where we have high FSH is that you'll have a whole bunch of follicles trying to mature. However, eventually one of them will win out because it'll just grow faster than the rest of them. And that means that it just releases a stronger inhibitory signal to the rest of the follicles. And so one follicle will eventually, like pretty early on in the process, mature as being like the primary dominant follicle. I think it's called just the primary follicle. So so primary follicle, we could say primary follicle emerges and it's dominant. And so it's the one that gets to keep growing, whereas the rest of them go back into being dormant until next time. Meanwhile, as they're all growing, estrogen starts to increase as well. So estrogen just kind of follows FSH for a little bit. However, as estrogen increases, where does estrogen feed back?
Where does it feed back to?
Yeah. What's its feedback?
To GnRH, LH, and FSH.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. Also to that stuff. So the estrogen feeding back onto the anterior pituitary causes a little bit of a slowdown in the release of FSH. And so as estrogen really starts to climb, FSH kind of tails off a little bit and will start to drop back down. And so you've got that happening while estrogen continues climbing and climbing and climbing. And so then this is the part that like probably most people don't understand or know about. Let me see, I need more space. I always do this. There, that's better. All right. So eventually the estrogen is going to continue just climbing, and that's just going to keep knocking down FSH. This entire time, LH and progesterone have been negligible. However, as estrogen continues increasing and increasing and increasing, right, it's going to feed back and inhibit any release of LH, any release of FSH, until there's these specific types of receptors in, I want to say I can't remember if it's hypothalamus or pituitary. I don't even know if it's MCAT relevant. I just want you to know how it works because it's easier to remember. But there's this threshold. And we'll say that this is this threshold for like I'm just going to make up these things like E1 and E2. I don't think they're really called this. Maybe they actually are, but estrogen 1 receptors versus estrogen 2. So we're going to say that estrogen 1 receptors lead to cause estrogen inhibits LH and FSH release by binding to those receptors on the anterior pituitary. Here, though, these are positive feedback receptors for estrogen. And so estrogen will promote or promote LH and really just LH. I'm just going to say LH just because it'll make it more confusing. But and I think it may only be LH. So estrogen promotes LH. So like positive feedback here. Right, plus positive feedback occurs here. So that but the thing about these E2 sort of receptors is that these are really low affinity receptors. So estrogen levels have to get really, really high before we actually start to stimulate this second type of estrogen receptors. So that's why I put this threshold here. So as soon as estrogen comes and peaks over this threshold, you get a really paradoxical response. And apparently there's like a really high density of those receptors in the anterior pituitary or hypothalamus. I really can't remember which one, but and so the really high density of them, low affinity but high density. So there's no response, but finally when there is, it's a massive response. And so that's what's responsible for this giant LH surge that we see happen right around day 14-ish of the menstrual cycle. And yeah, so LH surge occurs and that causes all sorts of chaos to reign. What else what does the LH surge cause?
That is when ovulation occurs.
Okay, so that's one of the things. So what is ovulation exactly?
Release of an ovum.
Okay. All right. What has to happen for the ovum to release? To be released?
What happened?
Well, what's the ovum hanging out inside of?
It's within the it has to travel through the tubes.
So, well, before it even goes up to the tube, so the ovum is hanging out inside the primary follicle. Remember,
right?
So the primary follicle has to rupture first, and so that's actually what this causes. So it's the LH surge causes rupture of the primary follicle, and that is what leads to release of the ovum into the fallopian tube. Right. So that all happens. Cool. What else occurs here? So we have rupture of the follicle, release of the ovum into the fallopian tube. What happens to the follicle?
The corpus luteum is formed.
Yeah, exactly. So the follicle does what every single book everywhere says the follicle involutes. I don't know what that really actually means. I mean, like shrink in on itself, I guess, but involutes and turns into this like nasty yellow thing. And so it becomes, and that is what the corpus luteum is. Why is it yellow? Why do they always mention that it's yellow?
Why do they always? I have never heard it mentioned.
Oh, really?
Yellow, actually,
that's funny.
But that's because I actually don't know why. Why is it yellow?
So the reason why it's yellow is because what's its only job? Once it forms, do you know you remember what the primary follicle does?
I believe it's the release of progesterone.
All right, sorry, the corpus luteum. Yeah, just all it does is just sit there and pump out progesterone. So it's just a progesterone factory. And so progesterone is a steroid hormone. You can know that because the name ends in "-one". So anytime a hormone name ends in "-one" or "all", that means that it's a steroid hormone. And so it's either the ketone version of cholesterol, because they're all derivatives of cholesterol. And so the ketone version, it will have the word "-one" at the end, and the alcohol version will have the word "all" at the end, and it just depends on what form it's in. So it's like, because you have like estradiol, and you also have estrogen, and you have estrone, you have testosterone, and you have like cortisol versus cortisone, like all of that stuff. So
Okay.
yeah. Anyway, so progesterol is the thing too. So so it's yellow just because it's making these steroid hormones, so they're just fat-based things. And so pretty much anywhere that you find massive production of steroid hormone, there's going to be a yellow tinge to it. So that's why they refer to it as
Okay.
yellow. Yeah.
Noted. I've never heard that.
That's funny. Yeah, just FYI. I mean, I feel like details like that are kind of helpful. Like, they're not going to ask you about it being yellow, but it might be said somewhere, and if nothing else, it'll help you remember. So anyway, so yeah, this thing starts producing a shitload of progesterone, and progesterone levels climb. Also, in response to that, like estrogen peaking over so the primary follicle ruptures here, right? So what do you think happens to estrogen levels?
Estrogen levels die back down.
Right. Because that's where estrogen was coming from. So yeah, estrogen definitely falls off because the thing was making estrogen. Okay. And so what do you think happens to FSH?
Both FSH and LH also die down.
LH goes all the way back down. FSH kind of rallies a little bit here though, and it's simply because estrogen is decreasing.
Okay.
Yeah. And so then you see this like weird little interplay between estrogen and FSH going on behind the scenes here, because then once FSH starts to go back up a little bit, then estrogen starts to make a little bit of a recovery too, and then they just like both end up falling off once progesterone really takes over, is in charge. So then, all right, so then progesterone just really going for it. Like, progesterone gets really, really high around like this point, maybe day like 24-ish. I don't remember the exact number. Exact number doesn't matter at all. But progesterone just increases and increases and increases and increases here. And because it's just the corpus luteum is just like making progesterone with no real feedback inhibition whatsoever. And until we get to this checkpoint spot. And that's why I was saying is like maybe day 24, could be a little sooner, a little later. But there's going to be a spot where you have either progesterone's going to start to fall back off and we're going to return to where we started, or progesterone's going to continue going up off of the page against my wall and up to the ceiling in my room in here. And so that's what happens if pregnancy occurs, right? Okay, so what is it about pregnancy that stimulates that specifically, that determines whether it falls off or if it skyrockets?
What is it about pregnancy?
Yeah, because something's got to happen, right? Physically, there's got to be some sort of signal. Huh? What is it?
Fertilization of.
Okay, fertilization happens.
The egg, the ova. Okay.
Yeah, so fertilization will happen, and then as soon as the zygote implants in the uterine lining, it immediately starts releasing a specific hormone, and it's the one that they test for in pregnancy ELISA tests. So, because it's in the urine way before any other signal of pregnancy. So this is beta HCG.
Oh.
Yeah, so beta HCG released by the embryo into the mom's blood doubles. It's got a doubling time of like, I think it's like 20 hours or something like that. And so that's why it is so prevalent, or why it's so good for testing for pregnancy, just because it gets really, really high, really, really fast. And so if beta HCG is present, then that is a trophic, with the H again, signal for the corpus luteum. And so it tells the corpus luteum, hey, stick around, get stronger. You've got a while left here. But if there's no beta HCG, then the corpus luteum throws in the towel and it's done. So yes, then trophic for CL, corpus luteum, leads to continue rise in progesterone. If no, then the corpus luteum will quit and progesterone falls and everything else falls as well. And we go back to where we started.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah. So there's that and this thing. And then they all dive back down to the baseline at the end. So that is the whole thing, I think. And we didn't talk about anything about what's going on in the uterus at this time, but that's kind of, I find there's just too many things to track to do that. So I just added in at the end. That's been my solution to this. So you already mentioned follicular phase, right? Which was the first half. So what does the follicular phase mean for the uterus specifically?
I mean, this is when the follicles are stimulated and growing and
okay. Yeah. So it's basically just like that the follicle is in charge of what's going on. Like the follicle is sending out the primary signal that distinguishes this phase, right? And so it's distinguished by estrogen. But specifically in the uterus, we have the uterine lining will hypertrophy a whole bunch here, meaning like it just gets way thicker. But so it puts on a lot of mass, but it doesn't do a lot in terms of like maturation. Whereas in the luteal phase over here, because that one was governed by the follicle, so this one's covered by the corpus luteum. In the luteal phase, the uterine lining doesn't really get a lot of extra mass. It really got all of that in the follicular phase. But what it does is we see a lot of uterine lining maturation, which just means increase in vascularization. Because the implanting embryo needs a large surface area for blood supply. So you see like the blood vessels in there start to become spirals rather than just like straight blood vessels, simply to increase surface area so that whenever the thing does implant, it has enough nutrients to keep its parasitic life alive. And then so that's why. And that is it for the menstrual cycle and that stuff. So that's what FSH and LH do. Just write C below. So then one last thing. What do FSH and LH do in men? Because you mentioned that they are involved in men, and you're right. This will get tested.
I think they regulate testosterone secretion.
Which one does?
Oh, luteinizing hormone.
Yeah, nice. Yeah. And what does FSH do in men?
How do I remember what FSH is? I can't recall.
Okay, so FSH in men will promote spermatogenesis.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And so that's kind of okay to remember. I mean, it's not the perfect correlation, but the FSH deals primarily with like the gametes of both sexes. That's the way that I remember it anyway.
Okay. Mm.
And then a couple more things on endocrine stuff. We had ACTH, and you mentioned ACTH leads to release of cortisol, right?
Mhm.
Okay, and do you remember where you said it comes from?
Where cortisol comes from, the cortex of the adrenal gland.
Yeah, nice. So cortisol released from the cortex of the adrenal. And so the adrenal gland sits where in the body?
Ooh, the adrenal gland sits near our kidneys.
Yeah, it's like the hat of the kidney. I always call it the kidney hat. So if so if you think about the adrenal gland that way, that I think it's a little bit easier though if you just take a cross section. So get a cross section of adrenal or of kidney hat. And you can look at it and you see these layers. So you've got the medulla here in the middle. And then there are 3 concentric rings that make up the 3 adrenal cortex layers. And you do have to know this. That's why I'm saying it. I'm not just in love with the adrenal gland. Okay, and so there's 1, 2, and 3 going inward. And you have to know what comes from each of those 3 layers here. So any guess of or hint of where cortisol comes from here?
Cortisol comes from the outermost layer.
It's actually the second one. I don't know how you could have known that, but
Never mind.
yeah, cortisol. Or a lot of times you'll see it's rather than just cortisol, you'll see glucocorticoids, but it's the same thing. All right, and then the innermost layer is the one that we're not really going to cover much on this test at all. These are just androgens, sex hormones. Matters more for women than for men, simply because men have a large supply of sex hormones from the testes, whereas women, this is like their only source of androgen. So adrenal like third or tertiary layer of adrenal cortex problems affect women. They don't really do anything to men, simply because it's just like a drop in the bucket that you're getting rid of. But that's there. So say DHEA is the primary one. And then the outermost layer is, you'll see these called mineralocorticoids, but the better name is aldosterone. And you'll learn about that in the kidney and next time.
Okay.
So yeah, it's responsible for like water regulation, but in a different way than ADH is.
It is also a steroid.
Yeah.
Oh, and
These are all steroids in the cortex.
yes.
And then there's and so I had these are miserable to try to remember just because they're all kind of similar sounding and doing and stuff. So I have to give you my like little way of remembering this. I learned this in med school, and it was told to us by a professor that looked like he might die any day, and so that it made it really funny, and he knew it was funny because he said it that way too. But so his saying was that the 3 layers of the adrenal cortex are his saying to remember them is that they are responsible for, from the outside to the inside, salt, sugar, and sex, and that you can remember that it's in that order because it gets sweeter the deeper you go. And so that was so picture this guy that like he took as long to say it as I did there, but not because he couldn't remember it, just because it took him that long to say things.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a really funny guy. Anyway, so that's my way of remembering that, and I'll never forget it because of that. So hopefully that works for you. And then there's also the medulla. While we're on it, adrenal medulla. Do you already know what it releases?
It releases, I believe it was epinephrine, and
Yeah, nice.
is it just
It's really
epinephrine, or is it
yeah,
all catecholamine?
It's really just epinephrine. I mean, there will be some small percentage of norepinephrine and maybe a little bit of like dopamine and tyrosine and stuff like that coming from there, but primarily it's going to be epinephrine.
Okay.
That's what they'll test you on. Yeah, so that is the adrenal gland.
Cool.
Yeah, and then for the sake of completeness, the thyroid. Then this is actually really important. So unless you actually just want to go now, because I know you've got like 16 minutes, this will take probably 5. But
Yeah, let's cover. I would actually love to
right.
cover the thyroid just because it's quite
Okay.
frankly the only one that I never learned in my endocrinology class, which is kind of stupid, but whatever.
It's really, the thyroid itself is a little simple. I mean, it's just like, so TSH is a peptide hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone is peptide hormone that comes in and it binds to the outside of the thyroid gland and just tells the thyroid gland to release T3 and T4, which are the thyroid hormones, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, do you know which specific stuff is responsible for making T3 and T4, or is important in making T3 and T4?
Which specific stuff?
Yeah. So there's T3 and T4. The reason they're called T3 and T4, T3 stands for like triiodothyronine or something like that. It means there's 3 iodine atoms in it, which is kind of weird. And same with
Oh,
T4.
yeah.
It's got, I think T4 has 4 iodine atoms in it. T4 is just, I think, called thyroxine because the like tetrahydro something was too long, so they gave it thyroxine. But they both have iodine in them, and they are both steroid hormones. And so one important thing with these, this is a good lesson for these, or that the thyroid is just the way that you see this taught most of the time. That's why I'm using it here, is that whenever somebody comes in with hypothyroidism or hyperthyroidism,
Mm-hmm.
but frequently hypo is the one's kind of hard to distinguish because it can look just like depression. And so if you ever see a doctor start somebody on an SSRI before checking their thyroid, they need to be punched in the face probably. Just because like that's just so much easier to treat than depression, major depressive disorder. And so anyway, so that's one thing. But whenever you do check somebody's thyroid, what do you think you look for in the blood specifically?
Um, I don't know.
So most people would
The
guess that you
levels
look for
of, I
thyroid
mean,
hormone.
the levels of TSH, no?
Yeah, you do look for the levels of TSH. Most people would think that you look for T3 and T4, but that's not really accurate to look for T3 and T4. Why might that be? Why would you look for TSH instead of T3 and T4?
Um, the only reason I knew that was because I got tested for it. So I know
Oh,
they checked
nice.
me
Yeah.
for TSH instead of T3 and T4. Um,
It's also really common in your demographic to have hypothyroidism, like really, really, really common. So that's
fair.
good. Yeah.
Is it because of the feedback loop? So like instead of looking for the um like if there's any potential dysregulation, it would make sense that TSH levels would be also out of whack.
Yeah, definitely. That definitely makes sense. But why not just look for the direct hormone? That might not just make it simple.
Um, Perhaps there are lower levels throughout the blood, just like everywhere, or no?
Maybe. I'm not really completely sure. The main reason is though that their actual levels in the blood are really misleading. And so this is the point that I'm trying to illustrate. Uh, is that they bind to, just like all steroid hormones. So this is one of the most important, probably the most important thing I'll say today, is that because they just test this kind of stuff over and over and over again,
Mm-hmm.
that steroid hormones can't move through the blood without being bound to something that makes them soluble. Because if you think about
Oh,
it,
right, they're not.
yeah,
Yes, they're not
blood is
water
water
soluble.
based. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, blood is water based. And so because blood is water, the stuff that moves around in it either needs to be soluble in blood or needs some other mechanism of getting around. Remember how it's like CO2 gets turned
Yes.
into carbonic acid and then bicarbonate to move around in the blood.
Yes.
Similarly, anything that is a steroid hormone, anything at all, has to have a binding globulin carrying it. And so all of these binding globulins are made in the liver. I think all of them, to my knowledge. Like, so for thyroid, it's thyroid binding globulin. Like, the name of it's not as important as just like the fact that it's made in the liver at certain levels, and then it floats around in the blood and picks up thyroid hormone and carries it to where it needs to go. Otherwise, thyroid hormone can't get out in the blood. And so you can, if you're measuring levels of T3 and T4 in the blood, what you're going to be measuring is not just like active T3 and T4, it's all the stuff that's bound to that hormone too. And so if somebody is just making like a relatively large amount of thyroid binding globulin, they could appear as if they're hyperthyroid. If you look at their T3, T4, like they might have really high levels of T3 and T4, but all of that T3, T4 might be bound to thyroid binding globulin and unable to get off. And so they may effectively be hypothyroid, where they actually have elevated levels of T3 and T4 as like opposed to normal, as compared to normal. And so by looking at TSH, because TSH is a peptide hormone, that's why I wrote that right there. By looking at TSH, you can get an appreciation for the effective levels of thyroid, because only free thyroid hormone, only free T3 and T4 are going to actually be able to do anything, have any effects. And so you may have somebody who has really, really low T3, T4, but if their TSH is also low, then, well, either you have a pituitary problem, or you have or maybe they're just hypothyroid or hyperthyroid, right? But that's easy to distinguish because you ruled that out before you did the blood test, because you can't confuse somebody that's hyperthyroid with somebody who's hypothyroid coming in clinically. Like, one of them's like upbeat, bouncing off the walls, kind of skinny, it's like loving life, and the other one is like dragging themselves in. So that's a distinction that was made before you ordered the test. So
okay, noted.
And so that's the case with all of these steroid hormones. That's why I don't know, I can't think of all the examples right now, but like FSH, LH, those are peptide hormones, but estrogen and progesterone will both be carried around on binding globulins as well. And so anyway, just so you know that albumin carries most things around. Like, so we'll talk a lot more about this idea. This is going to come up over and over and over again. So the MCAT loves little ideas like that, where they can test physics and biochem and biology all at the same time and like tie everything together. I feel like the people who write this test have no life at all. Like, they just sit around trying to think of like creative ways to test everything at once, which more power to them, but I wouldn't really want that job. That doesn't sound fun. Okay, I think that's pretty much everything we pretty much got through all of it. I'm glad we didn't try to do the kidney thing. I'm glad we did this, actually, because this is a really good basis for a lot of stuff, especially like this is really high yield. This little graph, if I were you, I would try to draw this graph without looking. And once you can get to where you can draw that graph without looking, that's a pretty good estimate that you have that stuff down pat pretty well. And that'll just continue paying dividends like for the next, I don't know, depending on what specialty you go into, at least like 6 years. So, because it just gets tested over and over, and that's cool. But awesome. And we finished in time. Great.
So I'll add chapter 10 to Tuesday, and that way we can cover that then. And
write down